This is a Mini Cooper. With its floating roof, round headlights, and those unmistakable Union Jack taillights, it is without a doubt one of the most iconic British cars of all time. It was designed in 1956 to fit 4 adults and their luggage into a footprint just 3 meters long. The team achieved it in just 9 months by pushing the wheels to the absolute corners, flipping the engine sideways, and letting pure function dictate the form. And then it went on to beat Ferrari at Monte Carlo 3 times. It became a cultural equalizer owned by everyone from the Beatles to the factory worker who built it. And of course, our beloved Mr. Bean. But today's Mini is no longer a Mini. It has grown bigger, heavier, and stiffer. BMW has packed it with modern safety and premium luxury. But in doing so, they have blurred the lines of the original blueprint. So to understand if the modern car still deserves the badge, we're going to do a complete design breakdown of its design DNA to see what actually makes a Mini a Mini. We'll look at the philosophies that made it a global success and figure out what lessons we can learn from the redesign of this iconic car. But to answer any of that, we first need to see how a Mini became a Mini Cooper. Before we start, I have a small request. If you enjoyed these videos, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel to grow. In 1956, Britain ran out of fuel. The Suez Crisis had cut off oil supply, and suddenly every British driver with a big car had a very expensive problem. So small foreign cars from Germany and Italy started appearing on British streets, and the chairman of the British Motor Corporation, Leonard Lord, hated them. He said that he was going to drive those bloody awful bubble cars off the road. So he called his chief engineer named Alec Isigonis and gave him one simple brief: build a proper British car. A car that would seat 4 people, use an existing engine, and be smaller than 10 feet. And do it fast. Now, Isigonis was more of an engineer than a designer, so he didn't work from reports or market research, so he focused on the constraints. 4 adults, their luggage, an engine, a fuel tank, and 4 wheels, all of it inside 10 feet. Now, as an engineer, the first instinct is to take the core technology, which is the engine, and then build outwards from there. But Isigonis started with the people. He put the passengers at the center and pushed the wheels to the absolute corners to maximize cabin space. And then he moved the engine sideways. This was something that nobody had done before, at least in a production car. But mounting it sideways freed up an enormous amount of cabin space. Then he optimized the gearbox, the powertrain, and even the springs in the wheels. Conventional springs took up too much space, so he replaced them with more compact and effective rubber cones. And in just 9 months, the team put together the prototype with 3 meters on the outside and 4 people on the inside. Then, in just 2 years, the Mini was launched on August 26, 1959 for just 497 pounds, less than a color television. But at that time, no one knew what to do with this strange-looking car. It was stubby, with tiny windows, and the wheels pushed out to the edges. But then people drove it, and because of those wheels right at the corners, Mini was quite agile. It changed directions like it had its own brain. Drivers who had never cared about driving suddenly cared about driving. The handling was so good that within a year of launch, amateur drivers were entering standard unmodified Minis into club races. And then even Formula 1 drivers like Graham Hill and Jack Brabham were being spotted at Silverstone, testing a Mini just to feel what everyone else was talking about. And that's when it caught the eye of one guy named John Cooper. Cooper was a Formula 1 constructor, and he saw potential in the Mini. So he went to BMC with a proposal that they let him tune the engine, upgrade the brakes, and badge it with his own name. And BMC thought that he was mad. He wanted to take an economy car to racing. But then they said yes anyways. So he did his magic, and the Mini Cooper was launched in 1961 with the same body, same matte geometry, but now with a tuned engine, twin carburetors, and front disc brakes. And then Cooper took it somewhere that made the whole world pay attention: the Monte Carlo Rally. It was the most prestigious motorsports event in the world. It ran through ice, snow, and alpine passes in conditions that were supposed to reward torque, weight, and power. Everything that Mini was not. But to everyone's surprise, in 1964, Paddy Hopkirk drove a Mini Cooper to first place overall. Then they did it again in 1965 and again in 1966. Although that third win was disqualified over a headlight technicality, but then it won again the next year in 1967. So 3 Monte Carlos, one tiny car designed to solve a fuel crisis, but then something happened that no marketing team could have ever planned. The Mini became a symbol, not of economy, but of attitude. Peter Sellers owned several of them. The Beatles drove them through London. Twiggy was photographed beside one. Enzo Ferrari, whose cars had just been beaten by the same thing, reportedly bought one just to understand how it works. And for the first time in British automotive history, an aristocrat and a factory worker owned the same exact car, and both felt like they were making a statement. The Mini had done something almost no design object ever manages. It became a cultural equalizer. And then, of course, there's Mr. Bean, which perhaps captures it better than anything else. The Mini didn't just become a car people owned, it became a character. Something with a personality, something that is alive. All started from the wins in Monte Carlo. By 1994, the original Mini had been in continuous production for 35 years, with almost no structural changes. That almost never happens in the car industry. Designs get replaced every 5 to 7 years. The Mini stayed because nobody could figure out how to improve this core idea without losing it, which is exactly what makes the next chapter so interesting. In 1994, BMW bought the Mini, and with that, they inherited a car whose design hadn't changed in 35 years. Because don't fix anything if it's not broken, right? And that's an almost impossible task for any designer. But BMW gave this responsibility to Frank Stephenson, who understood the simple and initially complete design of the Mini. He said it himself that the worst thing they could have done was start from zero. So instead of designing a new car, he sketched what the Mini might have looked like if it had evolved naturally every decade. A 1969 version, a 79 version, an 89 version, and then finally he arrived at 1999 through that imaginary progression. And when the result was launched at the Paris Motor Show in 2000, it was immediately clear that he had done something right. But to understand exactly what he got right and where the story gets complicated, we need to go detail by detail, because the Mini was a collection of very specific design decisions. So let's start with the stance. On the original Mini, the wheels sit right at the edges of the car. There are no overhangs. This gap between the tire and the end of the body is called an overhang. So there is almost no car in front of the front wheel and almost no car behind the rear wheel, because Isigonis just had a 3-meter box and he needed every millimeter of it for the passengers. So he forced the wheels to the edges. If you compare it to any other car of that era, you'll immediately see the difference. Every other car had long overhangs, a big bonnet stretching ahead of the front wheel and a long boot behind the rear wheels. Now, if you look at the 2001 Mini, it has the same wheels at the corners, same planted stance, but the overhangs have grown. And to be fair, some of that is not a design choice. Things like modern safety regulations require a collapsible structure at the front of the car, space that can crumble on impact, so a pedestrian is not hit with a rigid wall of metal. The first Mini never had to think about that, but today it's the law. But also, the short stance was a radical design in 1959. But today, every modern hatchback does it. The Golf, the Polo, the Peugeot 208, which means the stance that once made the Mini look unlike anything else, now just makes it look like everything else. But the overhang are only a part of the story. Stance also contains the overall width and height. If you look at the person standing next to the original Mini, the car barely reaches their chest, 1.35 meters tall and 1.4 meters wide. Now put that same person next to the current Mini. It's 1.43 meters tall and nearly 2 meters wide. It reaches their shoulder, which is still small compared to the American cars, but it's not that mini. So overall, in the stance, the wheels are still at the corners, but everything else around them has grown so much that the stance no longer does what it used to do. Because Stephenson was going for a bulldog kind of stance. So like a bulldog, it's low and wide. But stance is just one part of what made the Mini recognizable. The other thing you notice immediately is the face. The original Mini's front face was a consequence of packaging. The headlights sat where they sat because of where the engine ended and the body began. The grille was minimal because the engine did not need much cooling at those outputs. There was no styling agenda. The face looked the way it did because of the constraints. In the new Mini, Stephenson kept the round headlights. And rightly so, they are the eyes of the car, and changing them completely would have just broken the face. But he made them larger, more dramatic, and leaned them backward to give a more sporty feel. The grille also has grown into a more dominant hexagonal shape, and he also split it from the middle to give it that bulldog face, another British icon. And similar to the grille, he also divided the bonnet and made a clamshell bonnet that opens like a jaw to show the underbite of a bulldog. But I think the back of the current car pushes this even further. The tail lights now have a Union Jack daylight running lights, a detail that is clever, very British, and completely deliberate. I think the face is the one thing that BMW got consistently right in all the generations. Same round headlights, same expression, and all of them still feels like a Mini. And right above that face sits something equally iconic, that floating roof. This is a detail that most people may or may not notice, but they can feel it. The original Mini had enormous glass area relative to its body size. The pillars were thin, the windows were large, and you sat high enough relative to the car's height that the outside world felt close. And sitting above all that glass was that roof. But the concept of the floating roof actually came from the Monte Carlo rallies. For the races, BMC painted the roof white to keep the cabin cool and to have better visibility on the track. But with time, the white roof became a part of how people recognized Mini, not just on the track, but in their memories. It became one of the core design elements that Stephenson could not skip in 2001. So from day one, the new Mini launched with a contrasting roof as a factory option, white with red and black with silver, both with the black greenhouse supports. But especially that white with red is, I think, the best redesign of Mini's exterior. The red body, the white roof, the white side mirrors, and even the wheels. It was a perfect depiction of the character of a Mini. And of course, today's Mini has evolved a bit more. Now, from the factory, it comes in monocolor with the same or black colored roof. You can still get the white decals on the roof and on the front, but as an add-on. So if you want to feel the nostalgia, you can still go with the decals, but overall, with the greenhouse exterior, it still looks and feels a lot like the Mini. So now, let's go inside. When you step inside the Mini, the first thing that you notice is the feeling of being big. Because everything else around you is pretty small. You sit low, close to the ground, the windows are large, the pillars are thin, and the world outside feels almost within arm's reach. Like you're not inside a car so much as wearing one. And of course, because if you remember, the car was designed around the passenger. So the cabin feels much more intentional, and then comes the dashboard. A single large speedometer in the dead center, 5 toggle switches, and that's it. There's no heater, no AC, no padding. There's not even a glove box. You got some space above the whole dashboard to place some things, but that's it. And also, the speedometer in the center was more of a packaging choice. It was the one place it could sit regardless of whether the car was left or right-hand drive. So one dashboard that could cover 2 markets. In the redesign, he took this speedometer and made it enormous, almost theatrical. The toggle switches were now arranged in an arc. that felt almost like a cockpit of a plane. And now, even in the new electric Mini, they have still continued the same design element. The speedometer is now just a digital screen, but the switches and the overall feel is still the same. And for the rest of the interiors, the seats are properly bolstered now. The doors have real storage, there is a glove box, climate control, Apple CarPlay, parking cameras, and a full safety stack, which includes airbag, crumple zone, and lane assist. Honestly, that's just the cost of making a car that people will actually buy today, because you can't just sell nostalgia without also selling comfort and safety. But every one of those additions added weight, complexity, and structure. And that's the tension that new Mini lives in. It has to be a modern car first and a Mini second. And to answer the question, is the new Mini still a Mini? The honest answer is, it is, but partially. The face, the roof, the toggle switches, the wheels at the corners, BMW has preserved the things you can see and feel immediately. But the original Mini was defined by its constraints. Every good decision came from having no choice. The new Mini makes all those choices, but deliberately. And a deliberate version of an accidental design will always feel slightly different, even when it looks almost identical. Now, reviving any iconic product is arguably harder than creating a new one, because you're not starting from zero, you are inheriting some expectations. That's exactly what BMW understood when they decided to revive the Mini. They built the new Mini on three philosophies. One for the product, one for the identity, and one for the marketing. Let's start with the product one, experience over specification. When BMW inherited the Mini, the easiest thing would have been to just benchmark it. Take the original numbers, 3 meters long, 1.35 meters tall, 848 cc's, and try to match them with the modern engineering. But those numbers were never the reason why anyone loved the Mini. People loved it because it changed directions like it had its own brain. Because it made a factory worker and a beetle feel the same thing behind the wheel. Because it was alive in a way that larger or more powerful cars were not. So BMW asked a different question. Not how do we replicate the Mini, but how do we replicate the feeling of the Mini? That feeling became their product brief. The wheels still push to the corners, so the stance still feels planted and ready. The steering was tuned to be sharp and direct, so the car still responds like it has its own brain. The sitting position, it was kept low and close to the road, so you still feel connected to what's underneath you. BMW even renamed this as the go-kart feeling of the Mini. And then there are other elements that also earned their place, like the toggle switches that stayed, the round headlights stayed, the contrasting roof that also stayed, because these were the things that people recognized as Mini. And that brings us to the second philosophy of identity. Every object that survives long enough eventually develops two versions of itself. The real version, what it actually was, and the mythology, what the culture decided it stood for. The real Mini was a fuel crisis solution, a cheap economy car for post-war Britain. But the mythology of the Mini was rebellion, classlessness, and British wit, the underdog that beat Ferrari. BMW understood that the mythology had outgrown the object, and that their job was not to revive the car, it was to revive the mythology, to build something that still felt rebellious, still felt characterful, still felt like it had something to prove. But a mythology only survives if it stays relevant, and BMW had two different audiences to stay relevant for: the older generation who remembered the Monte Carlo, and a new generation who had never heard of it. So for the older buyer, the round headlights, the contrasting roof, the toggle switches, all of it became an emotional homecoming. And for the younger buyer, none of that history mattered. What mattered was that this car felt different from everything else on the road. The options to personalize everything, the premium positioning, the characterful design, all of it that said, this is not like everything else. So same mythology, but two different doors into it. And that's what kept it alive. So they had the product designed based on the feeling, with a mythological identity, and when the time came to market it, they chose individuality over identity. And not the identity of the car, but the driver, the customer. See, most car brands sells you a fixed personality. If you buy a Jeep, you are an adventurer. If you buy a Tesla, you are a tech lover. The brand has a character and you just adopt it. Mini also had this default character of being playful and nimble, but the new Mini always left a room for individuality. From day one, the new Mini came with a lot of configuration options. Roof colors, stripes, interior trims, wheel designs, mirror caps. No two Minis on the road needed to look the same. It was not saying that here is our personality and you just adopt it. They were saying that here is a canvas, you just go and finish it. And even their campaign, like Not Normal, was not about the car being not normal. It was about the owner being not normal. The car was just the signal. The person behind the wheel was the statement. And then in 2023, when they launched the new electric Mini, they called it Nice to Meet You Again. Not meet the new Mini again, as if the relationship was personal. That's what made Mini's marketing special. And not just the marketing, all three philosophies had one goal: to make you feel like that the Mini was made specifically for you. The three philosophies that BMW built are also lessons in their own. So if you're building something with a strong identity, something that people feel rather than just use, they might also work for you. So if you have skipped the philosophies, go back and watch it. But I think the most important lesson that we can still take is how to redesign an iconic product. And the answer lies in a single decision of knowing what to preserve and what to evolve. And it has three levels. At the top is what I would call the soul level. This is the emotional signature of the product, the feeling it produces that people can't fully articulate, but they will notice immediately if it's gone. For the Mini, that was the go-kart agility, the sense that the car was alive under you. BMW even gave it a name, the go-kart feeling, and built the entire car around it. Also at this level are the original constraints, the design details that exist because of a founding limitation and became iconic because of that limitation. The wheels at the corners existed because Isegonis had no space. The center speedometer existed because it worked for both left and right-hand drive. These details carry the story of how the thing came to be. So if you change them, you don't just lose a detail, you lose the origin. Below the soul is the character level, like the silhouette, which is recognizable even in the shadows from 30 meters away. Then there are some signature details, things that people refer to in a product during conversation. Like for the Mini, it was the round headlights and the floating roof. And then there are sensory signatures. It could be a sound, a texture, a weight, like the haptics of an iPhone, the click of a shutter. These are the elements that people point at when they say that that's what makes it what it is. And at the bottom is the contextual level. Color palette, typography, interior convention. All these things feel important, and they are, but they are somewhat reasonable. They can evolve with time without breaking the identity. BMW preserved everything at the soul and the character level, like the round headlights, floating roof, toggle switches, the go-kart stance, and then they let everything else, like the size, the safety structure, the interior comfort, evolve freely. Because those things were not the Mini, they were just the condition the Mini was born under. So before you iterate on anything you have built, map your own hierarchy. What is the emotional signature of a product? What are the origin constraints? What's the silhouette? What's the signature detail? What's the sensory signature? All those things are non-negotiable. Everything else is fair game. That's the main lesson. But while we are here, I want to give you one more thing that I took from the story. Win somewhere where you should not. Remember how the Mini went to Monte Carlo rally and won over Ferrari? Similarly, take your product out of its home turf and put it somewhere it has no business of being, and then dominate there, because that doesn't just prove that what your product can do, It changes what your product means. This is called the juxtaposition effect, and you can see it everywhere. Red Bull went to extreme sports from energy drinks. Yamaha went into motorcycles from pianos. Michelin started rating restaurants from tires. Because the best product don't stay the same. They just never forget what they are, like the Mini never did. So if you're also building the next version of a product, find your go-kart feeling, find your Monte Carlo. Because identity is not only what you add over time, it's also what you refuse to lose. That's all for today. I'll see you in the next one.